So I want to start off with a little bit of context for this whole concept of exploring engagement of hope, and then we'll get into kind of the introduction, the overview. But to start off with, my name is Dan Bergen, Executive Director of Community Engagement at Marquette University. I will ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Patrick.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Green, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Engaged Learning, Teaching, and Scholarship at Loyola University, Chicago.
And to my left on the screen, we have Cynthia.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Cynthia Stewart. I am the Director of Experiential Learning at Loyola University's Parkinson School of Health Science and Public Health.
Thanks, Cynthia. And then to her left, we have Chris Nayve.
Hi, everyone. Chris Nayve, University of San Diego, Associate Vice President for Community Engagement and our Anchor Initiatives.
So this group of colleagues came together a little over a year now, almost 2 years actually, to discuss the idea of faith and the role that faith-based institutions play in community engagement. And as we began to take that journey together as a group, and I will hand it over to Patrick to talk a little bit more around the methodology that we used, but we discovered this sort of notion of hope in the midst of this. And certainly the COVID pandemic really exacerbated a lot of that. And really the question that we came to this was when we do community engaged work, it is incredibly challenging. It's fraught with complexities. It can be very divisive. It can be very political. And so what is it that keeps us coming back to do the work? What is it that reminds us of the value of this work in the day-to-day? And so that's kind of the premise that we began with. So with that, I will advance our slides here. We're going to run through an overview of the Metropolitan Universities Journal special issue that we worked together under the leadership of Patrick. We'll do a presentation of our engagement of hope conceptual framework before shifting into some examples from each of our institutions that kind of animate this idea of an engagement of hope. And then we'll actually invite our audience to provide us with any thoughts or feedback as we continue forward, recognizing that like good community engagement and the relationships that are formed, it's always iterative, right? And that's important. So as you can see there, we've gone through and introduced ourselves. With that, I will turn it over to Patrick to kind of overview the intersection of faith and community engagement at urban institutions special issue from the Metropolitan Universities Journal.
Thank you so much, Dan. So as we worked on this special issue, as Dan mentioned, we were really exploring the intersection of faith and community engagement. And we received a number of proposals from authors all over the country who wanted to really explore and study how are community engagement and faith in relationship with each other. And we learned a lot through this process from our co-authors who wrote from faith-based institutions of higher education, as well as public institutions of higher education. And so we really also explored faith traditions, not just Christian faith traditions, but a whole variety of faith traditions as well. And throughout this entire issue and exploratory study, we really learned from the faith-based communities and the faith-based community-based organizations that we all worked with, and that our colleagues, the scholars and authors from these other colleges and universities across the country worked with as well. So in the process, our article, which was the framing article of the special issue, really challenged us to recognize the experience of faith-based community organizations and faith-based communities, because the work that was happening there was the work that was really instrumental to the communities and was foundational to the communities. So with that in mind, as we talk about anchor institutions, which tends to be in the literature a reference to educational institutions and medical institutions, hospitals, and often shortened to eds and meds, we actually came to the conclusion that we need to stop saying just eds and meds. We need to say eds, meds, and faith-based organizations, including churches and faith-based nonprofit organizations doing social service work. And with that, we kind of leaned into what we learned from these faith-based communities and faith-based organizations, that the type of a community engagement work that they were doing was rooted in hope. And so we really leaned into an engagement of hope. We then said, okay, we think we have a concept here and we need to study this further, drawing from our years of experience, our many years of experience that we all have of doing work in the community. Uh, we need to listen to the experience of faith-based communities and faith-based nonprofits, and we need to explore this concept of an engagement of hope. So if we could go to that next slide. We started with some foundational approaches to what was not only a conceptual framework, but actually a theory of change. And we, as Dan hinted at the introduction, we recognize that community engagement, this work is not easy work, that it sits in the center of tension. But if we do this well, it is centering multiple voices and acknowledging the lived experience of our colleagues in the community as a source of knowledge. It prioritizes relationships over transactions, so that in relationship with other people and with the communities in which we are living and working, that is how we are able to do this work. Again, learning from the faith-based communities and faith-based nonprofits with which we're working, anchoring in faith-based work in which God is at work in all things, and that we live in a universe of grace. And never has grace been so important than in these past couple of years, as we've interacted in the midst of several pandemics, a global health pandemic, a racial injustice pandemic, a politically divisive national movement, that we recognize that this difficult practice requires sustenance. To do this community engagement work, we need to be in a community of support and in support of each other. And finally, that we face these difficult issues, these wicked problems or complex problems that we are in the midst of, with a passion for the possible. So not addressing them as this will never be resolved, but rather recognizing this is incredibly complex, but with hope and a passion for the possible, we can move towards solutions together. Before we go to the next slide, do my colleagues Dan, Chris, or Cynthia have anything that you want to add about these foundational approaches?
I would just articulate that we developed these through the work with the authors and what they had produced in terms of this particular edition, this special issue, but then also we've iterated through these in continued dialogue with community engaged professionals and partners. And so we're continuing that process today and with all of you. So I would just state that.
I would just add, first, it's wonderful to be with you all, and thank you to the Social Development Commission for convening the summit. I'm so glad Dan's there representing our group. And, you know, what I would just, I guess, emphasize and echo is that, you know, given the last 2 years, spaces like today, what you're convening on is pretty critical in really helping us learn, you know, how can we continue to better serve our communities, especially given what's been happening around the world the last couple of years. And they continue to deeply impact the communities that I know many of us are from and identify with. And I'm just glad that, you know, I've had an opportunity to work with my colleagues on this project for almost 2 years, which, again, as mentioned, it started before the quarantine. And I think all of us, probably everybody here, and I know what is important to the commission, is that, you know, a lot of these issues are generational issues. that have really just kind of been further catalyzed. And so as the pandemic was raging, and as Patrick was mentioning, so many things were causing such deep divides. Really the concept of hope wasn't abstract. I mean, I know sometimes academics and academia gets pretty abstract, but we all work in faith-based institutions, and as we were reading the work and the collaborative work of our colleagues, I'll say this, that this working group was very generative and important for me. In a way, it became like a ministry and served as medicine for me. So that's part of the spirit. I know we're going to get into the nitty gritty in terms of other examples and how this manifests, but it's important for me to acknowledge that.
I would like to add, thank you all for having us to do this panel on today. And I would just add that one of the key things that came out of all of this, as Chris has mentioned, and Dan and Patrick, this has been a 2-year process. It will be, I believe, in December. But one of the things that is very key is how we each kind of brought our own experiences and experiences in various communities, whether it's in different states or at different universities. And one of the key things is that we were able to see a common thread that kind of came amongst all of us, and that spirit of hope was one of those common threads that we noticed that even though we are doing this work as scholar practitioners, we also notice that there's a tension that takes place in the midst of doing this work. And you'll hear some of that, or if you have read the article, you'll read about the tensions that each of us or other scholar practitioners who are doing community engagement actually experience when you're doing this work. And it's not about giving up, but it's about that hope that I am an agent of change. And that's one of the things that I think we all kind of saw that common theme.
Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. And I will add to all of those comments that we wrote extensively, and we wrote personal narratives and shared them with each other. We wrote collaboratively the article in the special issue and an upcoming article that will likely be published this week on the engagement of hope. And, it was through this collaborative research process and through the narrative writing that we did that we were able to then develop this conceptual framework. So if you could move to that next slide, Dan. So I know this may be hard to read. So in the center bubble, you see the engagement of hope, and in the bubbles all around, what you see is these characteristics of the engagement of hope. And again, not only is this a conceptual framework, this is actually an equity-centered theory of change. And so in that top bubble, I'm just going to go clockwise, challenging unjust structures. The next one is working toward the common good. The next one at about 5 o'clock is collaborative courage. The next one, going clockwise, community-centered. And then the last one, individual goodness. And so in this, we are actually trying to explain the themes that emerged from the faith-based organizations, the faith-based nonprofits that we have worked with, that the articles in the special issue worked with, but then also drawing from our own experience. Cynthia used the phrase scholar practitioner, and that is very much how we operated. And as scholar practitioners, we were really deeply inquiring into our practice and emerging from our practice. These are the themes that really stood out. Again, learning from and drawing from not only our experience, but our work with faith-based institutions and our work with churches, faith-based nonprofits in the various communities. So we wanted to animate this framework with actual examples. And so we are going to actually each share an example of how we have seen faith-based communities, faith-based churches, organizations bring this engagement of hope to life, what that actually looks like in a tangible way. So I'm going to ask Cynthia to start us off.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to the team. So one of the things that came out when we were working on our writing was I'm here in Chicago, and I have the opportunity of learning about a lot of communities within Chicago. I've done urban ministry for a very long time. I was a theology student, and I kind of wrestled with where's the church in the midst of a lot of the unjust systems that were taking place in various communities throughout Chicago. So one of the things that came up in our writing was I thought about one particular community, which is Lawndale, which is on the west side of Chicago. It's one of the historical areas of Chicago where actually Dr. Martin Luther King, when he was fighting for housing, actually lived in Lawndale. And it was during the time of after his death that, riots took place and different parts of the west side became disenfranchised. But one of the hopes that came within that community was Lawndale. So in 1975, not at the time, he was not a pastor, but Wayne Gordon, they called him Coach. He was actually a teacher at a high school called Farragut High School. And he was one of the teachers and a football coach. And he started mentoring a lot of the young men. And from that, he started having meetings with them after practice, and him and his wife would invite some of the team to come over to their house, and they just would open bread with them and just invite them over and just have conversations with them. And from that generated into the students saying, hey, why don't you start like something bigger where this is just not in your house? And they started asking questions of, so what do you all need? And one of the things that a lot of the students said was, we need a washer and dryer to be able to wash our clothes and have clean clothes to come to school. And all of a sudden they opened up, their basement and allow some of the team players to come in and use their washer and dryer. And then they bought, a washer and dryer. And from there, they found this lot of land and said, how about we open this up to the community? And from there, they got a plot of land and opened up this community center for the youth to have a safe space to actually come and to get away from whatever may have been happening in their home life or whatever's happening in the neighborhood. And it was a safe space. It was like the ark for them. And from that, 3 years later, he started the church, Lawndale Christian Community Church, in 1978. And from there, they really got involved in the community. And he wanted to say, okay, so this is happening with the football team. What else is happening with other individuals in this community? And they started doing research. And over the years, they found out, as you can see, what the problem was, that there were 1,000 vacant city-owned lots within the community, that 42% of the residents lived in poverty, that 3,000 housing units were unoccupied, and that 67% of the households were cost burdened and were at risk of foregoing necessities like food, clothing, and medical care. So all of this came about when they began to engage the community and began to go within the community and ask questions and to find out, what is it that you all need? So doing ministry with and not ministry for the community, and actually just finding out from them, how can we help? What can we do? And actually hearing the voices of the community. And the next slide, please. So from that birth, all of these entities that the church actually established. So the very first thing that was established was the Lawndale Christian Health Center, which is one of the largest health clinics actually in Chicago. So actually now, 30 years later, they have 4 health centers that are in different parts of different communities, as well as they have different ones within in the community on the same block as where the church is. And then also what was birthed was a legal clinic, because they noticed that that a lot of the individuals within the community were going through this cycle of recidivism within the jail system, and they wanted to put a halt on that. So they created the Lawndale Christian Legal Center, which provides free legal services to anyone that is between the ages of 14 until 24. Where they provide services for them and their families in order to help them not to have that cycle of recidivism. And then they also created what is called the Lawndale Christian Development Center, which is their community engagement, where actually that is the hub where a lot of whatever comes into the community has to come through the Lawndale Christian Development Corporation. They actually have done the housing that they have built there, a lot of the health centers that have been built, the senior centers, the senior center that has been built, all of that comes under the hub of the Christian Development Corporation Center. And then as you can see in the lower from my right is the Dr. Martin Luther King Legacy Apartments. That actually was established on the land where actually Dr. Martin Luther King lived when he was here in Chicago. That was a vacant lot, and 10 years ago, they made the decision that they wanted to build back on that land in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King. So there are apartments, and then it is where there's a health clinic also in that space, and then there are other spaces that are available for individuals to create their own businesses. And they also have a museum that honors Dr. Martin Luther King. They also created what's called the Green Tomato Cafe, which is actually on the land where actually the church originally started. So they built on that land, and within the Green Tomato Cafe is healthy eating, because in a lot of impoverished communities, there are not healthy places to eat where you can get fresh vegetables or getting a fresh nutritional breakfast. So also there is a health clinic also in there, as well as a exercise gym, where actually is $25 for a year for any of the individuals that live within the community. And at the bottom, you see the farm on Ogden. They partnered with the Chicago Botanical Gardens, and they actually have a full running garden that has aquaponics, and is fresh fruit, is fresh vegetables that individuals in the community can come in, and there's a store where they can actually purchase fresh vegetables and fresh fruits. There's a senior center that you see in the middle. There's an eye clinic. There's the Perkinson Center, and then there's an immediate care and pharmacy. And in the middle, you also see the Hope House. The Hope House is for men who are coming out of either some type of substance abuse, or if there is some form of, they are transitioning from the prison system. This provides a place of housing for them that they can stay there for a year. Their money is saved up, and then after their year, they are able to move into one of the housing that they have available. And then lastly is Illuminati's Pizzeria. If you've ever been in Chicago, this is one of the places that I highly recommend. If you ever want some Chicago pizza, is to go to Illuminati's. So Illuminati's is a family-owned restaurant, and their 10th restaurant, they actually tithed to the Lawndale Christian Community Church because they wanted to bring in a sit-down restaurant. This was before the Green Tomato Cafe was open. So it's a pizzeria. So the men that actually live in the Hope House actually are employed at Illuminati's. So the church is providing this sense of hope, where they are providing for the community, not deficits or seeing individuals as deficits, but seeing them as assets. So I will stop there and let the rest of my colleagues continue.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that overview. Dan, if you could go to the next slide. And I believe that Dan, you are up with your example next.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And as you can see in Cynthia's example, just such a great sort of community-centered, faith-based and faith-driven initiative in Lawndale, um, shifting more towards the sort of space that exists between institutions, higher education, for example, Marquette, and the communities in which they live, serve, and engage. Wanted to share a bit about the Marquette University President's Challenge, and really occupying that notion of the community-centered space. The the funding for this was a partnership involving Johnson Controls and American Family Insurance, and Marquette, and it was driven towards this idea that um, we needed the collective insights of our community members, of our community organizations, of our faculty members, of our staff and students in partnership, um, and to really explore some of these more complex issues and challenges, and opportunities, right? What's happening in our city that's really exciting? What aspects within our respective communities can we start to scale and support, and advance? And so with that, we've had several participants in those collaborations that have received funding and resource to advance the good work that's happening through a lot of these different organizations in our community. And what we've seen is some really incredible high impact educational practices. In the particular case of Feeding America, they were kind of struggling to identify how to effectively and efficiently distribute food in the midst of COVID. And so some of our faculty members partnered with them, along with some of our graduate students, to develop an application, as well as program materials to help streamline some of their supply chain and get food out more quickly to people. In the case of the Next Step Clinic, an incredible initiative that was launched through the Next Door Foundation. They were doing great work in terms of engaging families through a family navigator system for youth 0 to 5 years old, and addressing issues and challenges around autism, which is often underdiagnosed. And so partnering with them to really support those families and the kids through the Next Door Foundation. The Sojourner Family Peace Center, in the midst of COVID, the stay-at-home orders impacted IPV victims and survivors in pretty significant ways. And so we were able to partner with Sojourner, as well as the Milwaukee County courts, to go on to address the court system and how they might change, how judges might think differently about the policies or the ways they're approaching these particular cases under stay at home. So there's been process improvement, there's been elevated capacity, and system-wide advocacy, as I just shared, across these organizations. And that's something that I think, from a sort of community-centered, the collaborative courage piece across organizations and residents, members of each of these teams, to really drive substantive change, and develop models that can be replicated then in other communities. So that's a bit about the President's Challenge. Chris, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Well, as we, I really appreciate hearing the reflection of kind of this project and the work of our colleagues. And I saw on the Wahuba platform, I think is how you say it. Somebody had said, hope is great, but how does that produce any kind of like real change? And it kind of reminded me that during the Obama campaign trail, I think the critique of him was that he had this hopeful message, and then somebody had said, well, hope's not a strategy. And and as our work was unfolding, and we were reading about the important work of so many faith-based institutions from around the country and around the world, what kept emerging was that, sure, maybe hope isn't a strategy, but that it was very actionable. And that hope plays a really centering force in creating change during a really, time of great upheaval in society right now. So I think that's what our model represents, I should say. I recognize that things don't always fit neatly into a model, but we wouldn't be an academic institution or institutions if we didn't create some kind of model. But it was really kind of co-created and with community leadership and really about, as my colleagues were kind of sharing, how that path of change looks like when it is brought together and collective. In particular, I also want to hone in my example on the area of the model that's titled community-centered, because it really does understand, how to honor community histories, knowledge, and wisdom as part of our collective efforts. And while our context, we've been talking about is how academic institutions work with the larger community, I really do think that the approach is very applicable in working with partnerships in general. And in reading about the Development Commission, I really appreciated how it was framed as like these collective community agencies working, as a voice and catalyst. And so similarly in my slides, the example is about the work of my colleagues and I have been involved with in the border region of San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico. Our university is 22 miles north of the border. And we consider a lot of our work through a cross-border lens in very different ways than kind of like how the national and global media represents what it's like being on a border. And, in communities where there is so much border crossing, building community is sometimes challenging when it feels transient. But the two initiatives that I'll really share kind of show how our work is kind of blurs the lines between the border. It's rooted in Tijuana and it transcends into north of the border. Our university has been working with partners in Mexico and Tijuana, since the inception of our university. But over time, our partners felt it was time to really codify what that relationship looked like with a physical space for faculty, students, community members to come together and collaborate more closely. And I want to put a link here. And I don't know, feel free, I don't know if Dan can cue it up, but you don't have to, but at least you'll have a link somehow if this session is recorded. And that's a link to what eventually has become called the Tijuana Hub, which was launched this year and really driven and co-created by members of the Tijuana community as well as the cross-border community with a focus on binational issues such as immigration, economic development, education, health. So, if you move into the next slide, Dan, it felt natural for our partners to encourage us to co-create with them this physical space because of our history working together, and the work also extends north of the border because the border, like I said, is very dynamic. It's one of the busiest border crossings in the world. You actually have people who live, work, and go to school and cross daily in both sides. I mean, I have colleagues who work here at USD who live in Tijuana and vice versa. And we have many K-12 students who actually cross the border every single day going to school here. So this slide, similarly, we have faculty, students, and community partners who have been working with the same partners for a long time on a lot of the same issues that affect both communities. And so having the physical space, similar to us, many of our community partners, will have maybe a physical space in San Diego and they're working in Tijuana, or in Tijuana working in San Diego. So prior to the Tijuana Hub, the Turning Wheels mobile classroom is one of those crossover programs, and you see slides from that. It was conceptualized by community leaders and our chair of ethnic studies. He's also a member of the Chicano Park Steering Committee, and Chicano Park is an area in San Diego. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to visit before. And it's an area that's been marginalized generationally. And Alberto Polito, my colleague, and Maria Silva, my other colleague, over the years really built these strong relationships. And they've become considered part of the community leadership. And these murals in particular that you see on the mobile classroom are historical markers because they were created by community members, and they're actually on the pillars of a bridge that was a contested bridge that went over that community. And so the fact that if community members said, you know, we want USD to lead, co-create a community classroom, and we, you know, essentially will allow the university to represent our work, our collective work, by having murals on the mobile classroom. So, you know, as you all know, community members suggesting putting their sacred murals on a university bus is very meaningful, you know, when you consider community dynamics, cultural appropriation, and all of those things. And so I think it was indicative of the collective nature of the relationship. And that was, to me, again, going back to the model around this idea of how do we center community narratives and histories. So, you know, and then over the course of the quarantine, that mobile classroom, it was created before the quarantine, but since then it was used as an educational link for all kinds of communities, not just Chicano Park. It provided Wi-Fi access, a mobile hotspot. We partnered with our School of Nursing to provide COVID vaccines and education around that. So, you know, again, these particular programs, I think, demonstrate the fluid nature of the border work and programs, because the partnerships and programs really go, you know, both ways when it comes to the border. And then kind of lastly, I think what I'll share is, you know, why are these examples important for me, and how does that kind of embody hope as an actionable, you know, characteristic and value that drives change. You know, universities are notorious for decision making and being risk averse. And this year, when the Biden administration came in, you know, San Diego is one of those, it's like ground zero for many of the inhumane detention centers for undocumented youth, families, asylum seekers. And so when the Biden administration came in and asked cities, would you be willing to find housing solutions that are more humane? The International Rescue Committee and a coalition of partners, you know, asked, well, what can higher ed do? I mean, it's summertime, right? Don't you have all this housing? And, you know, this is not a knock on any other institution. But this collective work actually was the spirit when our team presented it to our cabinet and said, here's what's being asked of us, right? It was like we really rooted it to our core values. And we said, here's what, you know, here are some of the recommendations. Here's how the university can step up. So over the course of the summer, totally under the radar, without any communication or PR, the university housed families and asylum seekers over the course of the summer. And it was just powerful to see my colleagues across campus, you know, one of the associate vice presidents for operations helping build a crib, filling up the cabinets and pantry, our legal team providing asylum services, students in ministry coming together to work with the young people, you know, all kinds of ways. So, you know, I guess why I share this, you know, these are my examples of how I feel hope fuels our actions and create these powerful and enduring work, and why I think community-centered work shows up in the model in the way it does because of the, you know, collective nature. And I think it's a big reason why so many of us do this work, is because we all do have hope for the world. And I know we're way better than what we experienced the last couple of years. You know, many of us and many of you who are involved with change work, you know, at its core, it's extremely hopeful. And I'm moved by, you know, one of Dan's colleagues, I guess he's one of your colleagues there, Milwaukee community partner, Pardeep Singh, you know, and he says, you know, especially when using hope as a way to move away from like savior and transactional approaches, I think it really can become much more transformational. So thank you.
And so I'll just give a quick example, and then we'll definitely want to open it up for dialogue, and we'll ask Dan to lead us in that. The example that I'll give is from the Little Village neighborhood of Chicago. Little Village is traditionally a Latinx neighborhood, rich cultural uh, Latinx heritage, often referred to as Little Mexico. And the faith-based nonprofit that I want to share with you is Taller de Jose, which is Spanish for Joseph's Workshop. So this faith-based nonprofit organization is a member of the Congregation of St. Joseph Mission Network. The Congregation of St. Joseph are the Sisters of St. Joseph. There were several religious women's orders that combined a few years ago called the Congregation of St. Joseph. And so the Sisters of St. Joseph led the development through a Catholic church, also in the Little Village neighborhood, Our Lady of Tepeyac. And they developed this nonprofit organization. And as you can see from the slide, the mission of this organization is really a mission of accompaniment, of walking with people. And this really elevates that element of the engagement of hope that recognizes both a community-centered approach and individual goodness, and really sits in the tension of those. Um, and if you go to the next slide, Dan, Taller de Jose in this accompaniment model is really focused on walking with individuals to connect them to the services that they need. And because they're working primarily with individuals where English may not be their first language, um, then helping and translate. And so we know that navigating hospitals and legal services can be really complicated in our own language of origin. But when you're battling a different language as well and trying to move through complex organizations, that is really complicated. And so working with individuals, the staff of Taller de Jose literally walk, take public transportation, move to hospitals, courts, legal scenarios, meet with lawyers, helping individuals address their needs and address issues that they may be dealing with. Also providing them with access to the multiple resources around the community. And that whole idea of accompaniment, of walking with, is truly, I think, an example of an engagement of hope, of really meeting people, not just where they're at, but holding their hand and walking with them to where they may need to go. And I think that is at the heart of this conceptual framework and this theory of change around engagement of hope. So with that, I'm going to turn it, Dan, over to you to move us to, I think the next slide is just reminding us of dialogue and discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan.
All right, that sounds great, Patrick. Thanks. So wanted to take a moment, and I will shift us forward here into the strategy for action, and invite just any initial thoughts or comments here from this room in this space, or any of those of you watching in the virtual land, and just initial thoughts and feedback. Yes, please. Actually, you need a mic. Hold on one second.
Alrighty. Well, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts and encouragement, because I thought after a lot of the heavy topics that we have been discussing, and you know, all the things that we're looking to tackle, and trying to be solution focused during this poverty summit, it was like, oh man, I need a breather and go talk about hope. um, but I think one thing that I noticed was a trend throughout these different examples that you all showed was creating spaces is a lot more effective than just creating a building. You know, when you think about, like, when I'm thinking of, well, what's next? What's the next big thing to be able to actually make some progress? And I'm thinking, you know, creating this big building, but creating these spaces is where it started, right? You have these centers for these students to, like, you know, go and feel comfortable. You know, it started in the house with his wife, and then it grew into something larger than that. And so I think that's something that's big because you can get kind of lost in just the services that need to be provided, but creating spaces is such a powerful thing. And just like, the compañeros, we're able to, sit with those people and be relational, like relationship wins at the end of the day. And so I think that was something that was just very powerful and encouraging in that process, that in the midst of such systems, that relationship still wins, and that's what's really needed. And it's like, finding those gaps where we still have those droughts, and actually working towards that, and like faith and community. So yeah, because that can be very difficult to tackle. I was telling someone yesterday, like, I'm 25. I was, not too far out of school, and I'm like, well, what is my part in all of this? And so as I've been like trying to find that space, um, I have really enjoyed like learning to create spaces and really enjoying that. But sometimes it can seem devalued almost, in the midst of a system. And so it's like, oh, I love creating spaces for families and youth and stuff like that. But it can seem devalued in the chaos of numbers, right? You're in an organization and you're trying to get numbers, and numbers is a priority, but um, the relationship can kind of get lost in that. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was amazing. Yeah, thank you.
If I can just thank you so much for sharing that. I'm thinking about the so one of the places that happened in Lawndale was the youth pastor actually took a firehouse that had been sitting dormant for years in that community, and he turned it into a community center for arts. So it culinary arts and a music studio and a dance studio. But when you mentioned about the numbers, that was one of the things that he had to continue to tell people, is that you really can't really talk about the numbers until you're five years or more into what you're doing. So they were always saying, so how are you doing? And it was like year two. He was like, I'm still working everything out. I'm getting the kinks out. So that was very key, what you just said about the numbers, that sometimes when we're doing this work, people want to know, how many kids are you bringing? How many people's lives have you changed? And sometimes we have to remind people that it's not going to happen overnight. And I always remember that Pastor Phil said, get me past 5 years and then I'll give you some numbers.
I love that. I would just quickly add, I think, and I really want to credit the Community Nexus Institute for the framing of a theory of change that isn't really kind of part of the theory of change language. Sometimes is Andrea Smith calls part of the nonprofit industrial complex. And an equity-centered theory of change recognizes that funding models really do have to change, and it can't be driven year to year. And the idea of working with resource partners that not only share visions but share timelines, and it's been really, especially for you funders in the room, uplifting to see that timeline has been extended, because the relationships do matter, and you're not going to get it in a fiscal period often, and that these kind of what they're calling like shared collective impact resource sharing sometimes at best is generational, but maybe the middle ground is you get 5 to 8 or 9 years to say, hey, work collaboratively, not competitively. And really the focus is on community driven ideas and solutions. I think, I just kind of wanted to resonate with the movement that's happening in that sense.
I would like to just say wonderful work to all of you guys. This is amazing. I've been doing community work for over 20 years in the Milwaukee area, and I'm currently the program director for a nonprofit, a faith-based nonprofit. But when I look at the title of this workshop or this talk or seminar around engagement of hope, what I noticed across all of the presenters and the work that they were doing or presenting was not just relationship building, but trust. And so it's trust with the community, trusting the community partners and academia, but also families trusting to bring their other families to participate. And that's a big thing in communities that have been harmed. So I would like to echo that the change doesn't happen right away. It takes years to build relationships. It takes years to build trust. And in this work, I also noticed that we use terms like um, community needs assessment. And that's basically what you've done when you go to the community and say, what is it that you need? What can we do for you? Not, we see this as the problem and this is how you solve the problem. You're already starting with building that relationship and trust because they're like, oh, you want to hear what I have to say. My word, what I have to say is valuable to you. So I would just like to congratulate all of you guys on this work and encourage you to keep pushing because it takes a long time to build the relationships, build trust, and keep it going and sustaining it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to come back here over by the, are there other questions, Rosetta? Or, oh, there's one in the chat. Okay. Okay, well, is it, can you guys see it in the chat? Oh, awesome. Yes, please. Yeah. So the question was, how can you become more comfortable with being encountered with differences of opinion, right? Um, and and when doing this work in community engagement, I think you did answer it. You're exactly right. It's relationship, it's trust building, right? And I think, you know, as we went through this process as a group, and we have had lots of different conversations with people. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be difficult, right? And good relationships go through tough moments, but they sustain through that. And that's where the trust comes, right? And so learning to listen, learning to live in that space of tension. The Jesuits often talk about, and going back to this sort of faith-based orientation, they talk about holding things in tension, holding ideas and spaces and you know aspects of this world in tension. And that I firmly believe that's what community engagement demands of us on a daily basis, that we're trying to move forward in these systems and these structures as we've been talking about, but we have to hold some things in tension. So yeah. I love that. You captured that so well. And I don't know if my colleagues were able to hear that, but she was talking about how we're being called in this moment to a space of courage. And I think as one aspect of our engagement of hope here really highlights this, the collaborative courage, you know, that sometimes we have to collaboratively stand in these complex spaces and have the courage, but know, again, in a faith-based community, how we can, you know, support one another in different ways. So I want to be respectful of my colleagues' time and honor all of them and thank them for their time today. And also want to really, really appreciate you all for being here and offering your insights and thoughts. It's wonderful. It's great to be in this space with you all. Yeah, we look forward to continuing the conference the next couple of days.
Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, everyone. And may you dream together with courage and collaborative courage.
Great to be in this space with you all. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, team.
Thank you all, team.